So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining from. We are very glad that you have been able to join us today for this what promises to be interesting conversation around the reforms of the WTO. By themselves, not very easy conversations to have, even within the context of the WTO. In this first 1 minute, I would just like to introduce our moderator, Janet Macharia. She's a lawyer in Kenya, but she's also a lecturer at the Strathmore School of Law, but also part of the academic forum of the Afronomicslaw. And so, Janet, thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this. Thanks also to Khalil Badbis, who had reached out about this possibility. So thank you to you all and to Ohio. Janet, over to you.
Thank you, Prof, and everyone. And I will begin with some short remarks. I will start with thanking all of us for making time on Saturday. So for some of us morning, some of us evening or afternoon, wherever you're from, to have this very important and timely conversation, highly anticipated webinar, Africa and the Geopolitics of WTO Reforms. So today we will engage in crucial conversation that holds immense significance, especially in light of upcoming MC13 in February 2024. So this momentous event provides us with an opportune time to delve into the intricacies of WTO reform and analyze their potential impact on Africa's economic landscape. The goal today is to address key issues that have garnered substantial attention and concern. For instance, to acknowledge frustration around Doha development round and ongoing challenge that necessitates fresh perspective, I think, and innovative approaches. And by exploring how WTO reforms intersect with Africa's development agenda and what that looks like. And this conversation, I must say, is also important in light of initiatives surrounding reform goals. So we'll talk about issues such as e-commerce and even investment and understanding the evolving dynamics and implications of these initiatives, which I think is important to empower African nations with the knowledge and strategies which are important to move forward. So in the next hour and a half, our esteemed panelists who bring wealth of expertise, I must say, and diverse perspectives are going to help us by delving into these issues, into these pressing topics. And we hope that it will be engaging. So we encourage everyone to ask questions and participate because it's important to foster collaborative thinking. So I'd like to express my gratitude to our distinguished panelists for their willingness to share their insights and their expertise with us today. And I know that their contributions will enrich our understanding for sure. So I begin by welcoming all of you and introducing our panelists. And I will begin with Ms. Naidu, Vahini Naidu, who is Program Coordinator, Trade for Development Program of the South Center. Thank you very much for making time and for being here. Next, I'll go to Prof. Luwam Dirar, who is Associate Professor in Western New England University Law. Welcome, Prof, and thank you for being here. And last but certainly not least, I will welcome Prof. Olabisi, Viscount Bennett Professor of Law, Schulich School of Law, Dalhousie University, and also one of our mentors here at Afronomics. Thank you very much to all of our distinguished panelists for making the time. And I think in light of, the fact that we have already set the stage, I would like to begin by welcoming Prof. Olabisi to introduce, or to help us set the scene rather, by delving into the range of reform issues within the WTO and particularly why geopolitics matter in this context. And so I will just welcome you, Prof, and give you 5 minutes to set the scene.
Okay, so thank you very much, Janet. When we started the conversation about a month and a half ago, with Khalil. He reached out to me saying, we should have a talk with the academic forum. I thought, you guys have me at your disposal, and the best conversation that is possible shouldn't be with me alone, because there are people who are doing extremely important work that we can have a wider range of conversation with. And so it's happened that both Vahini and Luwam are here. And in the course of the conversations leading to what I'll put on the table now, I have, of course, benefited with different informal conversations with them. So, the subject of reform or reforms deliberately in any context is not an easy one. In a world that is significantly divided, not along easily binary lines, but several, lines at times overlapping, which someone that's other times described as zigzag, with a horizontal layer of it. It means, articulating concerns of states who are members of the WTO can really be challenging. The sort of reforms and conversations that dominated the Uruguay round that led to the major reform and creation of the WTO isn't where we are any longer. The world is confronting different types of challenges. There are social conflicts in regions. There are wars across different countries. But there are also a return of some of the more challenging issues that the WTO has sought to address. So we start with number one, the big issue, the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. Its appellate body is no longer functional, even though there is the multi-party interim agreement, which is stepping in to do the work. It is largely plurilateral in the sense that it's about states choosing to opt in or not. There's that question we might ask. There's the bigger question around the mainstreaming of the SDGs in the WTO. And we can articulate these in different contexts. We can think about it in the context of, whether the fisheries, subsidies, which we'll get to with Vahini's intervention. We can think about it more generally in the context of the environment issues that the WTO is dealing with. We can leave that aside and think about, even more peculiar issues around CBAM, what it's meant in the European context, what it means to other states across the different parts of the world. We can think about, issues relating to the many development issues, right, that developing countries have put before the WTO, whether it's in the context of the special and differential treatment or others. All these also are bounded by what role should the WTO play today. Should we rethink its role as the place for negotiation? Should we think about, it beyond its convening power and its multilateral function that allows it, or that has allowed it to do very important roles over the past years? Once you put all these substantive issues in a bucket, they all stack up against national interests. That's the very difficult thing to manage. Whereas it is often presented as though African states have a united front, as though their interests can be unified around the same issues. Those sort of narratives are often pitched against interests of countries like China, like the US, and maybe sometimes the European Union, which is not a state. And so what we thought of, and which has been part of my thinking for a while now, is that there are important, economically well-endowed countries that have played more active roles in the WTO. You think about the US, you think about the European Union, you think about China, you think about Brazil, India. So this is not necessarily about the West and the non-West, right? It's very overlapping in its range of issues. But these geopolitical concerns actually have implications for how we think about the positions that states advocate, especially when the states are least developed countries or are developing countries. And the reasons where they're unable to do so, of course, go across a range of challenges that we don't have time to deliberate on today. So rather than suggest a conversation around a particular theme, as for example, special and differential treatment or CBAM, or trade and environment, broadly speaking, or the reform of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, what we thought we would do is to actually come to this from the vantage point of the ongoing research we're all doing and the concerns that we are all trying to grapple our heads with. And so Luwam and Vahini agreed with me that it looks like a good idea to not all be intervening on the same issue, but rather attempt to really think about how various geopolitical concerns, alignments, disagreements impact on the substantive lines of reforms of the WTO that make it maybe easy or not so easy to think about. And hopefully in the next 45 minutes or so, we can tease up some of these issues for your own conversation at the end as well. Thank you.
Wow, thanks. Thank you, Prof, for setting the scene. I think that actually we just want to get into it, and I'm going to go to you, Ms. Vahini Naidu, and I'm just going to talking about different interests, and Prof has talked about the different interests. Maybe you could give us a sense of African members' positions in the WTO. What are they? How do they promote development and integration in the global economy? But also how they are received by the rest of the WTO membership.
Okay, thank you, Janet, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're joining from. Firstly, thank you so much to Afronomics and to all the colleagues. South Center is very pleased to be co-organizing this very important and timely webinar where we can share some of our perspectives. So as the South Center, we're based in Geneva, and we directly work with the developing country missions here, so the trade negotiators who are engaging on a daily basis in the WTO. And so I can say, at the outset that the African position, of course, is not homogeneous. Generally in the WTO, at a very broad level, I would say that there is an extremely high degree of convergence amongst African countries. And the primary objective is to advance development imperatives in WTO outcomes. And this is usually done through the African group in Geneva on WTO issues. The African group consists of 44 WTO members. And basically, through the expert level and the ambassador level, delegates consistently and regularly meet to develop common positions so that they can advance positions as a group. But just going into kind of more of the specifics, I would have to say that for the last maybe 2.5 decades, the African group have been very active in advancing a certain set of issues in the WTO. So the most prominent issue I would have to say would be in relation to clarifying existing rules that were basically extremely inequitable by the time the WTO had come into force. And so a large part or a large component of the African agenda is to see how we can redress some of the inequitable rules that were agreed in the Uruguay round. And so these relate to negotiations, for example, on clarifying provisions as they relate to infant industry protection, for example. So basically, one of the proposals in the Committee on Trade and Environment in special session is in relation to clarifying certain provisions where developing countries, in particular Africa, but also the G90, and this consists of the African group, the ACP group, and the LDC group, to basically have the policy space to establish any particular industry and basically on the understanding that a member will not be challenged, that they will not have to compensate any other affected member, or that there wouldn't be any kind of retaliation. So this is very important in the context of Africa's industrial development agenda. The policy agenda coming out both from Addis, but also in Accra through the African Continental FTA negotiations. In addition to this, there are so many other provisions as they relate to technology transfer, to TRIMS measures, to ease them. There's a very, very important paper on policy space in the WTO as it particularly relates to the structural transformation of African countries. And maybe it's worth pointing out that a big one now also relates to subsidies. So the African group have tabled a very important paper where they're basically asking members to reform the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures because of a range of development goals such as regional integration, technology research and development funding, product diversification, the implementation of environmentally sound methods of production, for example. So those are kind of the perspectives in terms of amending the subsidies agreement that is informing the African perspective. Maybe just the last one I'd point out is on public stock holding for food security. So one of the biggest issues in the WTO has been the massive trade distortions in agricultural trade. So in addition to redressing the subsidies around price support given by developed countries to their farmers, there's also another agenda in relation to public stock holding for food security purposes. And this is basically to improve and have a permanent solution around rules that would allow African countries, but also developing countries more generally, to purchase, stockpile, and distribute food to people in need. So these are kind of the main issues. And now just speaking about how these issues have been received. I mean, the world is really going through some major shifts, and there is a very pronounced agenda to mainstream the Sustainable Development Goals into the WTO. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that there is a major onslaught to the development agenda in the WTO. And so we are seeing an exponential increase in unilateral measures. We're seeing massive subsidies being given to industries, ostensibly in the name of national security, in the name of climate change mitigation, in the name of, basically trying to mitigate climate change. And so unfortunately, we are seeing that there are direct impacts that these subsidies and these kind of unilateral measures are going to have on developing countries, in particular African countries. In addition to this, one of the big challenges around the negotiations, the active negotiations, is on the issue of development. So I'm sure you are all aware of the notion of special and differential treatment in the WTO, which basically recognizes that countries are at different levels of development. And this has been a fundamental principle of the GATT since developing countries began to gain independence in the 1950s onwards. But increasingly, we are seeing that there are narratives and proposals being tabled by the global north to introduce differentiation. So they want to divide developing countries and target larger economies. We are also seeing major challenges with respect to new kind of ways in which to exclude developing countries. So this is through opt-out, for example, a complete intransigence on engaging on the G90 proposals in the CTDSS. There's been a major, currently, or at least last week, they've started negotiating the actual text that ministers will be negotiating at the MC13. And a big debate for several hours focused on what exactly is development. And so this can kind of give you a sense of how difficult it's going to be to even get a mention to special and differential treatment in the WTO. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Naidu. And I think that something you said that I pinned right there is Africa's industrial development agenda and how that plays out when we talk about reforms in this context. And I think I'll just throw that question right to you, Prof. Luwam, and ask you, particularly in the context of the AFCFTA, how African countries effectively navigate these intricate dynamics between the AFCFTA and the WTO, particularly in that context, for example.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet. And thank you, Vahini and BC, Ohio, and everyone who's here today. So I'm coming at this from a theoretical perspective. I have not worked in practice both with AFCFTA negotiations or what is going on right now at the WTO. So as I look at both initiatives from the outside, some of the questions that come to me, at least in the AFCFTA, is what are we doing in terms of inclusivity, development, and our engagement on gender issues, for instance? And what are the African countries that are negotiating at the WTO level doing to push that agenda forward at the global level? If we look at WTO back at its initial stage, gender seems to be an afterthought, right? If you look at GATS and GATT, there was no emphasis on women or minorities. So at least now, at the stage where we are at the AFCFTA, even though I'm not 100% happy, we have a protocol that is being negotiated on gender and youth. And I don't think African countries, we as African countries, have a homogeneous identity or even a homogeneous agenda internally to even start pushing on those externally at the WTO level. So when I look at this question, one of the things that I would have liked to see, and I would like to see, maybe Vahini could tell us more from the practical side on this, is how are African countries pushing this agenda of gender at the global level, right? We're talking about MC13. We're talking about what is development. But in our negotiations at the AFCFTA, we're looking at women, even in that protocol that we are negotiating at the African level, we're looking at women only as traders. We are beyond traders. The impact of trade has significantly and disproportionately affects women in our continent. If we're adopting a neoliberal agenda of free trade at the AFCFTA or at the WTO, how are we making sure that that women and minorities are not going to be the losers of that agreement? So this is more of a questions that I'm asking rather than a response, Janet. But these are questions that I am struggling with, and I'm sure Vahini is in a better position to engage with them, but I just wanted to throw them to the forum as well.
Hey,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. And maybe I'll allow you, Ms. Naidu, to maybe address some of the things that came up from Prof's reflection before I ask you the next question, which would touch on the fisheries subsidies and other initiatives that we've seen ongoing. Yes,
So did you want Vahini to come in, or do you want me to come in?
Either of you. I just wanted to see whether there is a 1 minute sort of like.
Yeah. So I mean, I think one thing you said, Luwam, you're being provocative here, so I'll be careful how I jump into this. But you're right in saying, gender issues, and one comes at it not having a a set definition of that. So I think, so I acknowledge your note on that. But even in the context of the WTO, the first book that I think has just been put together was recently launched, at the level of the WTO. So there is a sense in which one looks back, if you're thinking about it, in a much more theoretical, academic lens, version, and say, how much importance do we really put on these issues? As a male, I must be careful about what I say. But I do think, as you have said, that maybe we at times are too patronizing in how we talk about gender and trade. And anecdotally, you are right in the sense that we tend to valorize, the women traders on the informal end in the African context, without thinking of them as innovators, for example, without thinking of the bigger spaces in which they shift the needle, in which they move key issues, right? I'm careful of celebrating the one story, but it's not only the current DG of the WTO, for example, that has done a lot, right? There are many deputy DGs who are doing interesting work that are supporting her in that role. So it is not my area of focus, but just on the 1 minute of being provocative, I think where I'd like to put it is that I would love to see more of articulation of the confluence, right? Of what, not just who is identified in that bucket of the gender, but the range of issues that are being talked about are dealt with, because it's really difficult. And so where it leaves me in my own space is really how does the WTO or even other trade institutions deal with this? We're yet to seriously find out issues of subsidies, core traditional trade issues. To drop the gender narrative in it seems very much like people are paying lip service to it, in my view. And I don't think it's the way it should go.
Thanks a lot, Prof. I was keen to get a response to that, because I think there's many layers of issues that could be said when we talk about trade and gender and how it's addressed at that level. But I think this is a good time to pose another question to you, Ms. Naidu, particularly on the recent reforms that we have seen at the multilateral level. So we all know the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement adopted at MC12, and a mandate. So I would like for you to address this, negotiating outcomes, particularly in the context of fisheries subsidies, and mandates to undertake economic and necessary reforms at the WTO. So maybe you could share your insights on African members' offensive and defensive interests across these two pillars. I think that would be a good way to turn the conversation forward.
Okay, thank you. So I think maybe I should just explain that at the MC12 last year, in kind of an unprecedented way, for the first time, a fisheries subsidies agreement was adopted at the WTO, and there was a lot of hype around it. But we did a number of assessments, and we worked with a lot of developing countries in these negotiations, and one of the biggest challenges has been that if you go, deeper into the negotiating text, what it basically shows is that there is not really much confidence that the WTO can do something substantially meaningful in terms of sustainability, despite the propagated claims by the WTO that it can do so. As you will know, the upcoming ministerial conference in February is also supposed to be delivering on another mandate with respect to the Part 2 negotiations to fisheries subsidies as it relates to overcapacity and overfishing. But just to give you a sense of kind of what's happening in the negotiations. So the current negotiations to discipline fisheries subsidies given to large industrial fishing fleets that actually cause the overfishing and the overcapacity are still, according to the first part of the agreement, permitted to continue giving the subsidies as long as they have measures in place to maintain a biological sustainable level of the fish stock. In other words, there is no test or there is no demonstration of proof to determine the effectiveness or the obligation of result. And so in that manner, it's very cosmetic, the fact that there is a so-called prohibition, because in effect, there is no prohibition. You simply have to just have a measure in place, which you could have introduced 10 or 20 years ago, and you could say, well, I have the measure. And so, unfortunately, that's kind of the policy orientation that has informed the dynamics in the negotiations, where large subsidizers are basically refusing to undertake or take accountability for their actions. Now, in terms of the African group, they have a range of offensive and defensive interests in the negotiations. So presently, they're quite active in the Fish 2 negotiations. And basically, I would say their core interests relate to ensuring that there is that the core focus of the text with respect to overcapacity and overfishing relates to large-scale industrial fishing and fishing-related activities, so that we can actually have a meaningful and legitimate outcome and even thereby meet SDG 14.6. The second issue relates to environmental sustainability, but that there is a very deep kind of view amongst developing countries that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, historic responsibility, as well as special and differential treatment have to be core parts of this agreement, so that those responsible for overfishing and overcapacity actually undertake the obligations to reduce or prohibit their subsidies. And finally, the big one, and this is of particular interest to African coastal members, and that relates to a complete exemption and carve out from the text with respect to small-scale fishing, which includes a small-scale and artisanal fisherfolk. As you know, in so many of our countries in Africa, along the coast, it's a very, very important industry for livelihood and food security purposes. And so we are championing, as the Africa Group, an agenda where we do not want small-scale or artisanal fishers to be subject to any disciplines. With respect to this big kind of agenda to mainstream environmental sustainability in the WTO, unfortunately, we're seeing that the narrative has primarily shifted to one of market access and liberalization. In other words, open up your markets, have a deregulatory approach. We're all the same, so we should all be treated exactly the same. You should undertake the same level of commitments, etc. And unfortunately, it completely undermines the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It undermines the treaty embedded rights to special and differential treatment. And also generally, it ignores the fact that we are at different levels of development, and therefore our capacity to undertake and actually implement commitments will really depend on what's being negotiated. And so therefore, as the South Center, we've been very concerned with the direction in which things are moving. And this is also part and parcel of WTO reform. And so we've been considering that instead of kind of only pursuing this mercantilist agenda through trade and environment, perhaps we could start looking at a more holistic and kind of cooperative framework in which to advance trade and environment together in the multilateral track. And so this includes issues like integrating trade-related SDGs in the WTO. It includes things like building in common principles to enhance the productive capacity building of developing countries, in particular African countries, because this also speaks to the industrial development component that's really a big part of Africa's agenda. It could also maybe eliminate non-tariff barriers, because we've been focused so much on market access, where many African countries are not actually part of the major value addition productive processes, and therefore the elimination of non-tariff barriers, for example, the simplification of procedures, the convergence of standards and regulations, having more mutual recognition agreements, could be more softer areas that could be looked at to facilitate the so-called trade and environment agenda. Then there were other major things which I think I should just briefly point out, and that is, when we talk about trade and environmental sustainability in the WTO, it's quite illuminating that the WTO does not really address the notion of raw materials or critical minerals in the WTO. And when we look at it from an African perspective, and we're talking about geopolitics here today, I would have to argue that the real development agenda is around the extraction, around the access, and around the trading of raw materials and critical minerals. And so why not find a place for having discussions on these issues in the WTO? And so part of the so-called cooperation framework could include perhaps enhancing transparency and accountability in the extraction and trading of raw materials. So this is looking at mining practices, prices, agreements, disclosure of processing activities. What about sustainable extraction practices, reclamation activities to restore the land back to its natural state? How are we addressing the displacement of local communities? Is there enough transparency around environmental impact assessments, around mining agreements, around compensation for environmental degradation resulting from activities? And so those were just like some of the ideas that we've been thinking that would certainly advance Africa's interests, but also to bring more light and more relevance to an actual realistic development agenda in the WTO that is not only focused on market access and completely opening up your economy.
Wow, thank you so much, Ms. Naidu. And I think I'm just going to retain this flow right here and go to you, Prof. Vahini, particularly on the African sort of like positions and priority areas that have been highlighted, and ask you, do you see African countries making progress at MC13, particularly on the issues that Ms. Naidu has just talked about, critical minerals, trade and environment? I'm just going to give you an opportunity to just jump on right here.
Okay, so that was for me. I was distracted for a second, but that's because Vahini sent me on a quick errand with her intervention. So I'll put the link to the WTO trade policy for climate action tools, actually, is what I wanted to say there in a second. But, I think, there's a broader issue. Let me put it in a different way. The way I sort of like the conversation the three of us are having is that we're not looking at these issues from the same perspective necessarily, even though we hope that we can have that sort of conversation. Issues of, trade, issue of environment, climate change, subsidies, as you've rightly noted, market access, non-tariff barriers. These are all, in a sense, manifestations, right, of a certain way of thinking about how the trade order operates, the multilateral trade order. You can argue in a sense that, they show the vertical nature of it. In another sense, you can argue that they actually just show the capacity of different states to articulate their own interests and ensure that, they get reflected in the drafting of the agreements. I'll put one more link on the table, but this is where I go with this response. I'm not extremely excited about what MC13 can bring. In fact, one of the links I have shared is about the WTO fisheries subsidies tax. If you follow that particular tweet and look at the retweet, now I'm not one of those persons who tweet nonsense, I hope. So this can really be useful, you would see people express very interesting thought like, oh, I'm shocked that they won't be able to do that. Perhaps speaking to the enormity of the task at hand, and that these issues are deeply contentious. And so for me, it's less about MC13 and more about the fact that the fragmentation that currently characterizes the WTO needs to be addressed. We seem to be sitting on the edges and hope that the tweaks that happen at the reform level, at the fisheries subsidies level, drum up non-plurilateral and say we are still multilateral, might cover, right, the deep issues that are there. And since we're talking about geopolitics, we can name the elephant in the room. The US is driving us all in different directions. And I've had this informal conversation, I can say it because of the sincerity of these conversations. I think the US has a strategy of incoherence that is not making us put our name, a hand or a thumb on anything they're doing. I mean, you can ask yourself with respect to the dispute settlement mechanism, what does the US want? We don't know. Ambassador Thai comes up, says this today, tomorrow says that. But if you ask what the African group wants, I'll read it to you because they have their report that is already stated, which I have open here. Just give me a second. That has been clear. This is their report to the WTO in June this year. We, the African group, want discussions and negotiations to remain open to all delegations and that members are able to raise issues of concern to them throughout the process. They want a multilaterally mandated facilitator or co-facilitators to hold periodic formal transparency meetings. They want all members to have effective access to all information within this process. They want the allocation of time of different issues of concern to members to be undertaken in a participatory manner. I'll put this in the link in a short while. But the point I'm trying to make is this. You do see in the context of the geopolitical conversation we're having that the powerful nations that had grandfathered rights are continuing to just take us in different directions. Africa as a continent is driving multilateralism today. The US is not driving multilateralism. It is advancing unilateralism and protectionism under the guise of national security. So to think that with a powerful state who refuses to support the appointment of the DSB panel appellate body members that led to his ground will be part of conversations in MC13 that will move agenda forward is not serious at all. It's not a serious way to think about the issue. So for me, in the context of MC13, and as Jean Kelsey has said, I'm not a naturally pessimistic person, but I think if we want any modicum of optimism, it has to be that we put the bigger issues on the table. For example, there's a report I encourage you all to read. Make of it what you will, Remaking Trade Law Report Project. It's one version of thinking about how climate change and climate action interacts with trade. But I'll put the trade law report there from the WTO and you can compare them. We have to be sincere. Development issues remain at the table. Doha development round is more or less dead, right? Yet you have agricultural subsidies that the developing countries want being at the top of what US countries are doing. I am speaking to you from Canada, where the government is investing big money in critical raw materials, in industries that will produce batteries for the future. Right? Developing countries hardly even have enough to meet their daily needs of infrastructure. And so you see at the very moment we're talking about how trade can affect climate action, a different type of inequality is being created because the investments that are being made today by the US and Canada and certain EU countries will only mature down the line a decade from now. Where will African countries who are raw material suppliers of these products be at that time? Your guess is as good as mine. I'll leave it for now.
Thanks. Thank you, Prof, for that very honest reflection. I'll move to you now, Prof. Luwam, and just switch gears a bit because we need to also talk about the EU, yeah? And I'm just curious from your perspective what the EU position is on the reform and success of at MC13. I'll just give you an opportunity to thank you.
Thank you, Janet. So my intervention will overlap with some of BC's and Vahini's intervention. On Thursday and Friday, there was EU-China summit in Beijing. And for that meeting, the German Economic Institute developed a report that aims to harmonize what EU position should be for that negotiation, but also for EU's position at MC13. So that institute, or the German Economic Institute, was arguing that EU should support African states to call for elimination of subsidies, but they had a very tailored view of where subsidies should be eliminated. They were arguing that the current trade regime is distortive and was actually helping Chinese car battery and electric car manufacturers to dominate the market. And their goal does not necessarily align with the African states' goals that we heard from Vahini. And they had this particular focus that EU should support African countries when it comes to local content requirements and to grant subsidies on environmental protection. But that is to be pegged to African countries voting on the side of the EU when it comes to their position towards China. They didn't articulate it that way, but that's what I thought. And from reading that paper, so what is interesting for me is where that leads us to the next conversation. Where are the minerals coming to produce the car batteries that we need to make electric cars? And then we go back to Africa, right? EU is Africa's biggest destination, export destination, right? For imports, we import significantly more from China than any other country. But when it comes to export destination, we are still exporting more to Europe. And if you break down what we are exporting, we're mostly exporting raw materials. This was the point that Vahini was making earlier about transformative development. Let's stop sending raw materials. We are at a point maybe we can produce and send processed goods, right? Or beyond, or manufactured goods beyond raw materials. Maybe we don't have the capacity in all its senses, but there are definitely African countries who might have differentiated capacities in that regard. And just looking at where the EU was pushing, it's not necessarily about supporting, for me, it's not necessarily about supporting the African countries, because if that was the case, then elimination of agricultural subsidies would have been one of the main points that they would be supporting. And this is a cause that African countries have brought in front of the EU for several decades. We can go back to the dispute on the banana case in front of the WTO. And if you look at that, it was all about subsidies, right? It was not articulated in that way, but access to European markets and where Germany stood in that dispute. Germany that imports most of its bananas from Latin American countries wanted the elimination of preferential access to African bananas to European markets. And it's not necessarily Latin American farmers that were going to benefit from this, but Monsanto and Chiquita and other big American corporates, companies that were farming in Latin American countries. So the geopolitics is complex, and the position of the EU, in my opinion, is self-interest maximization, not necessarily a support for African subsidies, but maybe I don't want to go to the point that I hope to make at the closing, but maybe we can see how we can play this as well. As far as I see, the EU's role is to maximize their interests and to benefit their own industry. And it's about who's owning those mining companies. Most mining industry of rare minerals in Africa is somehow owned or run by Chinese state-owned companies. So how do we make sure that we get something out of it is a question I do not know how to answer, but I hope the participants will keep on thinking about.
No, thanks. Thank you, Prof. I'll just go back to you again, Ms. Naidu, and I think at this point I'll just encourage our participants to think about the questions that they would like to ask the panelists, and if you would like, you can just put them on the chat so that we can move a bit quicker. But again, to you, Ms. Naidu, I'd like to ask you that seeing as where the conversation is going, and we're talking about a well-coordinated agenda by the Global North to foreclose policy space of African countries, particularly, we just talked about it, agricultural trade distortions, or constraining ability to develop the fisheries sector. You talked about the goals that we have for phase 2, etc. I'm just curious, how can the WTO serve African members more meaningfully going forward?
Thank you so much. So it's actually a very loaded question, especially after hearing from Professor Bisi about his prospects for MC13 and the future of the MTS. But I think, on the ground, it's really concerning about the tactics that are being used. I mean, these are, have been used, they're time old, and it's just really challenging because of the massive kind of divide and rule tactics that take place on a daily basis here in the WTO. But I think the first thing I would want to say that there is kind of these murmurings under the reform agenda where some, in particular developed countries, in particular the EU, are trying to change the nature of decision-making in the WTO. And decision-making in the WTO takes place through consensus. And there is provision for voting to take place. But this would be a very, very worrying precedent that would be set if we do have to go down the voting kind of avenue. And so the first thing I'd want to say is, of course, the preservation of decision-making by consensus is very, very important. But the reason why I'm also mentioning this is to also give you a sense of, on the ground, in the actual negotiations, amongst experts here on a daily basis, but also the incredibly difficult situations when trade ministers are engaging in negotiations. And this refers to what is known as green room meetings. And basically, it's small group meetings where only a handful of countries or trade ministers or members are invited to a meeting. And unfortunately, we're seeing that there is an increase in this kind of approach. So there is a very strategic kind of way in which countries are clubbed together, and narratives are being kind of advanced, but also that certain issues are being pushed. Now, the problem is that because the WTO has 164 members, the EU in various reform documents argue that because of this large number of members, consensus is almost impossible to achieve. And therefore, we need to find kind of ways to have flexible multilateralism. And this is the notion of the fragmentation of the system by introducing kind of plurilateral agreements or joint statement initiatives, where if you are interested in a particular negotiation, or if you are interested in developing new rules, they are asking for a mandate, a blank check, to say that I will move along with interested members. And this is very concerning because we're talking about a multilateral trading system that is intended to serve all its members. It was developed with a purpose that the work would be driven by governments, by members, and in particular that there would be a more pronounced effort to have multilateral outcomes over plurilateral outcomes. And so here, this notion of small group meetings and green rooms is important in the context of consensus, because consensus in the WTO means that you actually have to speak up. And so I just find it really interesting. There's been a few occasions in the past where some a handful of developing countries have actually used their right to veto negotiations. And it's interesting that the EU is spinning a story that countries use it irresponsibly. But then you look at the issues that they are kind of force feeding, in the WTO. And what's very interesting is this issue of the dispute settlement mechanism. And that what nobody really talks about is that the US has invoked their veto power. I think we're talking about 66 times now or 65 times with respect to blocking any appointment of appellate body judges. But nobody talks about that, and so consensus decision making is really important also for African countries who might not agree with a certain negotiation. But the problem is that you are not invited to the room. So what we're seeing in the WTO is that it's being constrained to only a handful of members. And so not all 44 African countries are invited to meetings anymore where very, very important decisions are being taken. So it's kind of just left to the responsibility of the coordinator of the African group in that particular year to agree to something on behalf of the entire group. And so this is incredibly unfair and it's incredibly problematic because I'm not sure one particular member can take such an important decision on behalf of everybody, while also noting that enough time is not given to the coordinator to go and consult with the group. And so here I'm really talking about the procedural concerns with ministerial conferences. And we have a range of papers and submissions, and the African group themselves have tabled a range of submissions in terms of ensuring that the processes in which we are developing substantive rules are inclusive, open, and participatory and open to all members. In addition to this, I think it's important for African countries to consider the idea that maybe there should be a moratorium on rulemaking in the WTO. There's two perspectives here. One is the perspective made by Prof earlier with respect to the dysfunction of the appellate body. And so the question is, if there is no legitimate two-tiered enforcement mechanism, why are we creating new rules? Okay, so that's the first perspective. And then the other perspective is the African Continental FTA is going on. And if you remember, there used to be a provision in one of the heads of state summit documents that said that we are encouraging African countries not to sign onto any new FTAs with countries outside the region or outside the continent. And unfortunately, we then subsequently saw that the US specifically targeted Kenya to commence negotiations on a bilateral FTA. And within the East African community, there was a very, very big challenge with how to work around this. Because one, you needed the consensus of the EAC, but also how would this affect regional and continental integration through the AfCFTA processes. And so, perhaps if we have this big continental agenda and kind of policy imperatives in place, together with Agenda 2063, why not take a very extreme consideration to the fact that we are not ready to take on more bad rules in the WTO, especially if they are not serving us. So maybe that's an idea to consider. The other is, of course, for the Africa group to be incredibly proactive, which they are, I have to say. There are a number of submissions. Colleagues are very active in the negotiations. So that's really positive. But I think one addition, and I think this stems from both the academic perspective, but also in terms of capacity building and how governments can train their incoming diplomats. And that is because the WTO is now undertaking so many issues that are kind of trade adjacent. I think that deeper training is also needed in the capitals on a range of issues that are now ostensibly being done in the name of trade. And I can give you an example. When I was a negotiator in the WTO for South Africa, we were dealing with electronic commerce issues, but it was a very, very minuscule agenda that was only related to the issue of having discussions as they relate to trade and e-commerce. But then it kind of advanced to a range of internet governance issues. And this is where the notion of the joint statement initiative on e-commerce has come in. And it's not only e-commerce, it's digital trade, it's digital economy, it's internet governance, it's competition, it's about electronic authentication, it's about spam. You know, there are other international bodies, and there are different there are different government departments and ministries that deal with a range of these issues. And so we're seeing that, you know, this massive forum shopping taking place where issues are just being kind of launched in the WTO because of its internationally legally binding nature, but also because of the power imbalances in terms of the developed countries who have the capacity to advance certain agendas succeed, whereas developing countries are typically always on the back foot, always responding. And so this is an important challenge, you know, that I've seen for a really long time, which I'm hoping capitals can start to rethink, and maybe even start sending colleagues who have experience on digital economy issues, who have experience on private sector issues. That would be very important. And I think finally, on another kind of process, but also substantive issue, and this relates to how issues are being advanced in the WTO, is that it's very, very important and in the interest of Africa that we ensure that the WTO continues to maintain its member-driven nature. We have seen the establishment of an advisory board by the WTO DG with the private sector. We have seen that reform proposals are seeking to find a formal role for the private sector in the WTO, even though it's member states from government departments and trade ministries who negotiate on behalf of the governments, and each country has their own internal consultative mechanisms to balance the private sector, the business, the industry, the labor perspectives together with the government perspectives. And so this is increasingly problematic, in particular for developing countries and African countries who will be continuously responding to kind of this business idea to rules, and not necessarily a development one where governments usually approach issues from a balanced perspective. And also maybe just to say on this notion of you know, member driven, since I've already mentioned, you know, the EU has been responsible for a lot of the divide and rule that we're seeing. At the COP28 just last week, there was a trade day that was unprecedented and, you know, really given all the hype. But interestingly, you know, developing countries, no, actually not developing, all WTO members, maybe with the exception of the EU, had expressed deep concern with the organizing of this trade day at COP28, because members were not consulted. You know, this is completely being driven by the WTO Secretariat. And the challenge has been that there are a range of policy recommendations that are being taken at Trade Day, where I think there's issues on hydrogen that have now been released. There's climate policy options that have been released. And then there's an op-ed that has been done in the Financial Times with the IMF MD, with the WTO DG, and the president of the EC. And so the question is, why is the WTO on a panel writing an op-ed with a member state who represents 27 member states in the WTO? And so this goes back to the notion of the WTO has to continue to be member-driven as per its constitution in the Marrakesh Agreement, but also that the WTO Secretariat have to maintain their international character. And for that, according to the Marrakesh Agreement, they must be impartial, and it requires neutrality on their part. And so, and then the issue that was actually being pushed was on carbon pricing, which is another issue that was being kind of imposed on members in the WTO, but several countries had rejected the notion of bringing universal carbon pricing into the WTO. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for the very comprehensive answer. And I think this actually goes to the next question. To you, Prof, and I can see you smiling, because my question is going to be, maybe instead of talking about reforms, the conversation should be abolishment. And I want to know what you think about whether we should abolish the WTO, What would be the implications of that in light of the things that we've just discussed, particularly in light of the issues that have just been raised right now by Naidu? I'm very, very curious to hear your answer on this one.
So as I think about this question, I go back to 2012, a conference I attended where James Gatti organized on international law, and Professor Matwa was closing, and one of the remarks he made was, we can either reform or abolish or work with what we have. And that's the kind of question that that made me think about the question Janet posed. So this is where we are. To start with, we were not part of the formation of the WTO. The reform agenda that we have been trying to push has been very slow in terms of actual significant change. So why not just move on and start our own, right? In theory, that sounds possible, but it's going to be significantly difficult in actuality, partly because we are also global actors. We can't live or exist in isolation. But so maybe if we are not having the success that we have, I think we should focus on our own internal integration systems that we have in the continent. So that's where I want to drive the conversation there. The WTO as it stands is not working for us the way we want it. That doesn't mean that we're not going to engage with it. We will push our agenda, but like Vahini beautifully summarized it, the African countries are not being invited to the negotiations. And if they're invited, there will be one country or one representative, and there will not be an option to consult with the others if Africa wants to abstain. And that is a very Eurocentric conception of Africa being one, to invite just one representative to start with. We're not a homogeneous group that we can be represented by one country, right? Europe is not represented by one representative in those negotiations, right? I'm sure they have a bunch of representatives sitting there. So I think the question is, in the US, if you look at the question of WTO, a lot of conservative politicians are saying it should be abolished. This was back in 2020. There was a New York Times article where a Republican congressperson, if I'm not wrong, from Missouri, Josh Hawley, argued that the WTO should be abolished because it's distorting and favoring trade for China. Our reasons are not the same. When I'm arguing like maybe we should walk out, it's not necessarily we're walking out. We're just going to put our emphasis on our own regional integration schemes. Let's work to improve what we have in the continent. So like the negotiation skills that we are taking to Geneva, let's put the same effort in our own internal negotiation. I'm not sure, but I don't think we put the same negotiators or the same skill set when we negotiate internally, or when we try to set our own trade agenda internally, or trade adjacent agendas as well, not just trade or trade and environment, trade and gender. So that's what I want to see. The knowledge that we have developed outside and inside should be combined, mostly to improve what we have internally. I'm not supporting the conservative politicians in the US that are saying let's abolish the WTO. But I think maybe we should put our emphasis on our own internal systems. And the article by Jen Kelly, it's excellent. I would recommend everyone to read it if they have not read it yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. And speaking of strategies and way forward, Prof. Lucy, I do have a question for you on whether there is any role for a global South coordination, similar to the new international economic order, perhaps more targeted to contemporary needs.
So thank you, Janet. So I think, this is the last conversation we're having, and then we can go to Q&A. If you're fascinated by history, then, the new International Economic Order 50th, anniversary this year, and, many things have been written about its success, its failure, whether legacies of what looked like failure, but now success. Now, part of that is the rise of the general South-South conversation that has happened. But clearly, what we know today is even the notion of South-South collaboration, partnership, whichever way we look at it, breeds a lot of those types of challenges we talk about vis-a-vis the global North. So my argument won't be for South-South collaboration necessarily. Do we need it? Yes, but not in the way it was envisioned many years ago. So to start with, let me make 3 points as I conclude. Number one, I think it's important to continue to put the searchlight on the powerful actors of the WTO, or generally speaking, multilateral trading regime, or international economic law trading regime broadly, if you think about the investment law bucket as well. Why? Number one, there are strategies that are pursued, whether in the trade or investment law pocket, that, point at different directions. And I did mention this idea of incoherence as strategy in the pursuit of reforms. And it is this idea that, some may call it divide and conquer, but it sends you in different directions. And you really don't know what these actors, are really getting at, whereas they are actually achieving their goals of disrupting the regime while all that is going on. So you might think, for example, about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, right, that is being written about in the US a lot right now. And, if I ask myself, what really is it with the trade pillar taken out of it right now? It's just another way to disrupt. You will say it's a response to global value chain coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, but really, no, it's to fight China. And to the extent that it helps them achieve that goal, let's get it done in a sense. That may be simplistic version of it. It can get much more complex, but I'm conscious of the time. So I'll put that on the table there. You think about industrial policy. I gave a talk, I think, last week, and we are in an era of renewed industrial policy. It is really unfortunate that African leaders are not taking advantage of this time. And so it is not enough to point the finger at the failure of the WTO and the powerful states alone. At some point, we look at ourselves and we have to say, what are we doing in response to that? There are structural, systemic issues that have to be dealt with. But this moment of industrial policy around critical raw materials must not let the 1970s, late 1970s agricultural tariff reduction catch up with us. Because we are not the only continent that has these critical raw materials. And the moment we're in trouble, you would see the investments will fly. And so we have to think about how our own governments respond to this in much more interesting ways. So I come back to the third point, which is to agree with Luwam and to agree with Vahini that, WTO will have to rethink its role in today's world. I think its role in negotiations as a negotiation forum is still relevant, but maybe not as a multilateral regime any longer. In my view, it looks like the issues on which the world can agree at a multilateral level are now so small because of these geopolitical concerns that have assumed greater resonance within the debate in the WTO. So in the interim, African states have to think about how regionalism is advanced. It is one area where in certain buckets we've done very well. If you're thinking about the role of courts and how the opportunities and alternative ways of pursuing different types of human rights cases, to some extent trade cases, that's fine. But we have to think about how the AFCFTA and indeed all the other sub-regional platforms that we have can advance trade. If we are able to do that, then we can possibly start countering some of the more systemic issues around how the African group, passes on some of the information or represents the continent on the issues that are tabled before the WTO. Not to suggest that the member states won't have their say any longer, but a clearer, right, identity about what our regional integration schemes are and what they're about means we are likely going to present a much more formidable front before the WTO. I'll stop here. We are conscious of time. We don't want to go over time. So we have about 30 minutes. I'll let Jeanette go to the Q&A, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Bisi. Thank you, Ms. Naidu. Thank you, Prof. Luwam, for your reflections, very honest reflections in this session. I'll just go directly to the Q&A. So how we're going to do this, I'll give an opportunity to anyone whose hand is raised, and then I'll read a question, and then we'll just bounce it off to the panelists. So I can see we already have a hand up from Mr. Boyce. So I'll just go ahead and give you an opportunity to ask your question.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and I'm so delighted and thrilled to be, to participate in this wonderful section. I just want to ask a question with regard to the role of the WTO in the fast-changing world. We've observed the world moving from COVID-19, moving from the war in Ukraine, moving from we're now talking about climate changes, moving to food insecurity. These are all the global challenges that we're facing. And when you go back to the negotiation, the Uruguay negotiation, you see that it seemed to me that members were more interested. The developed countries were more interested in market access pillars, the negotiations, export subsidies, because they wanted more market to export their good. They wanted to put in these rules, and that will enable them to have access to market, also be able to export their good into the world market. But then when you look at the domestic support agreement on domestic support, you see that the problem at the WTO, most of the problems that we're facing when we talk about reforms at the WTO are coming from the domestic support pillars. The green box measure, when you look at the green box measures, the amber box measures, and the blue box measure, this is where we have a lot of disparities. I mean, we have countries having the liberty, we call it a schedule of concession. They have the freedom to do whatever they want to do, and now we now have an opportunity. We now have a problem where there are now new actors coming up. We have India and we have China coming up, and then how do we what do we consider the role of the WTO in the fast changing way? Where do we see ourselves moving forward with the domestic support agreement on domestic support? Do we see a problem with the green box? Should we reconstitute? So should we go back to that particular agreement? There's not much debate in market access. We don't have a lot of debate in export subsidies. Everyone is agreeing. I mean, there's not a lot of debate on that area. Where we see a lot of problems is with domestic support. Do we see the WTO moving into re-evaluate domestic support agreement to see where some of these issues can be aligned, some of these issues can be resolved? And then what is the role of the WTO in the fast changing world? Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you for your question. I'll just allow the panelists to note it down, and maybe I will ask another question from the chat box, and we can have 2 questions for this round. And I'll just ask a question from on the chat box from Prof. Otheo to you, Prof. Bisi. Could it be that the US is deliberately being coy in its position regarding the DSM and other WTO reforms because it no longer sees the system as a viable platform for pursuing geopolitical interests? And so I'll just give you an opportunity, and then we can also address Mr. Boyce's question.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks, Sohail. So look, I can't guess what the US is doing for them, but I know that the US knows how to use dispute mechanism when it concerns them. You only need to look at the USMCA or COSMA, depending on where you are, whether you're in the US or in Canada, depending on how you call it, to see that they actually advance them. In that context, they bring disputes up there. So this is not a country that is in disorder or disarray or that doesn't understand what it is doing. What we can't sit down as outsiders to try to do is to articulate it on behalf of the US. And that's why my view about their strategy is a deliberate incoherence for us to guess, right? Clearly, the decisions that have gone against them in the WTO have been the offshoot of some of the pushback they've had. The idea that the WTO appellate body, in their view, has gone beyond the way they were conceptualized to work, the notion of judicial precedent, amongst others, right? So these are concerns the US is no longer willing to back down on. And it's not a Trump conservative or democratic, problem. It's just a US trade policy. The Biden administration is forging ahead with the Trump era's administration, as he has done with Obama's. So this is really not a thing we need to think about once we're thinking about the US. They know what they're doing. The system as it is no longer working for them. And the only way that will happen is, for them to make sure it's dysfunctional. So yeah, geopolitical interests are being pursued. You can look at the USMC and see what they're doing there and see that they clearly are advancing their own interests. Isn't it also interesting, for example, and this is anecdotal and occupied, that the US is still able to meet with the Chinese leader amongst all these, rhetorics of disagreements and issues on the side. So I think when it comes to the concerns of the powerful entities, they are able to agree. Whether it's the EU, whether it's the US, whether it's China, they find ways to frustrate, right? Push-throughs that would have allowed developing countries to make way. You can think about the COVID-19 pandemic and think about the push for access and how that ended at the end of the day. So I'll keep quiet here. Yep, they're pursuing their interests. I don't find it hard. I don't find it problematic that they're pursuing their interests. I find it more worrisome that African countries are not using this moment to advance their own interests as well, despite AFCFTA and the rest.
Thank you, Prof. Bisi. Ms. Naidu, I'll give you an opportunity perhaps to respond even to Mr. Boris's question.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I completely agree with the colleagues' questions about the green box and about domestic support, and that's where the major challenges exist, of course. And, this issue of box shifting has been a primary concern for developing countries and African countries for a very, very long time. And in the actual negotiations, there have been several efforts to kind of reopen and redefine the criteria on green box in order to make the subsidies, coherent and to fulfill the actual mandate to reduce subsidies in this area. But the box shifting area, or the box shifting kind of tendencies by the US and the EU have been incredibly distorting. And so in the actual overall negotiations, I mean, the ideas that come to mind where developing countries have been tabling proposals relate to things like, I think it was capping your total green box expenditures for developed countries so that you can avoid any further box shifting. So it was to pretty much put a cut on it. There was also the notion to allow for, I think it was direct payments only in the case of natural disasters. And so to kind of make up for where production is lost. And that there would be certain thresholds that could be negotiated. There were also ideas to, I think, either limit or to completely eliminate subsidies provided under the decoupled payments, as the payments will necessarily be coupled either directly or indirectly, as we have seen in the past. And I think one of the big ones was also the notion that structural adjustment programs would have to be time-bound to mitigate the kind of cumulative production challenges that we've seen happen in the past. So developing countries have been championing this, but the big dynamic in the negotiations right now on domestic support has basically been around when you want to go after the reduction of subsidies through the domestic support pillar, it always gets linked to market access. So they want countries to agree to open up their markets on agricultural products, reduce tariffs, etc. And in addition to that, there's also the standalone mandate on the public stock holding for food security purposes. So when that agenda or when that negotiating issue gets heavily advanced, the linkages to other agricultural pillars becomes a very big topic. And so on domestic support, developed countries will tell you in the negotiations, yeah, for sure, we're ready to engage on this, we're ready to reduce our subsidies. But what we're seeing in the actual proposals on the table is that they are also targeting the larger developing economies like China and India to also reduce their subsidies. But one of the most inherent kind of problems in the agriculture negotiations is that we're still working off a reference price from the 1980s. And so this completely distorts the calculations when we look at per aggregate farmer, how subsidies or how domestic support is being given. So yes, just to say that I do agree, and more attention needs to be given to Green Box. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Naidu. We have another last question, I believe, from Tana, who asks, is curious about, in particular, the situation UN citrus fruits last year, and would like to know the following thoughts from the panel. Number one, the impact of phytosanitary measures and the narrative that it's simply protectionism in disguise. And secondly, how can the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism be improved? And I'll give you, Prof. Luwam, first chance to contribute to this question.
Well, I'm going to engage with the second question. And so speaking about the dispute settlement mechanism, what can be done would be, I think it's for the US to stop vetoing future appointments of the appellate body. And we need, there are three main important pillars for the reform of WTO. One is negotiations, how we engage with the negotiations. The second is the dispute settlement mechanism. And the third is the enforcement. So the negotiations and the dispute settlement mechanisms, if we put them on par at this moment, looking at how negotiations are being done, we are frustrated with that. And Vahini has beautifully summarized that for us. The dispute settlement, both BC and Vahini touched on it. And one of the main points is that we do not have an appellate body that is functional at the moment. And that has been because, as Vahini said, 65 or 66 times the US has vetoed that. So I think maybe that could be a way to move forward for the US to agree to the appointment of an appellate body, but it's part of a bigger geopolitical concerns the US has, right? So the system as it is working for China, not for the US as much as it did in the past. So what are the interests of the US? Are they willing to be in a position in a multipolar world instead of being the global world, the most powerful state in the world? Are they willing to be in a stage where the system can also work for other countries that are not historically allies with the United States? And that's, I think, a political decision that the US has to make internally. Not just the USTR has to be engaged on this, of course, the other US branches as well. And just to speak about the US government organs, and there are different policies that are coming out from different organs of US government that are inconsistent towards Africa. So you might see some progressive agenda coming from certain agencies that might not have the support of other agencies. So just, I think the appointment of the appellate body is the quickest solution, but that will depend on bigger geopolitical negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I can see that we are way 2 minutes out of time. And so I will just allow me please to close the panel conversations at this point and welcome Professor Hill to give us the closing remarks based on the reflections we've had in this session.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been an excellent conversation. Special thanks to Professor Olabisi for convening this wonderful panel. It's a good way for the academic forum to bring to round up the year of our guest lectures. Want to thank everyone who was taking our time during this weekend to come and listen to our esteemed speakers. And Janet, we also want to particularly thank you for your excellent moderation and keeping on top of all the issues and synthesizing everything that's been said. Thank you to Vahini. Thank you so much to South Center as well for collaborating with Afronomicslaw and the Academic Forum on this. We are deeply appreciative of it, and we hope that this will not be the last of collaborations with you. Luwam, it's so great to see you again. It's always a pleasure. And I hope everyone's able, there's been a number of excellent links which have been shared. Hopefully we'll be able to collate this and we can make this available to those who are interested. Please do follow our different social media platforms, and we would have this recording when we've scrubbed it and done some little bit of editing. We'll make this available so that we can in the future reflect on very important points that have been raised in this about this very timely conversation. And obviously, as MC13 is around the corner, I suspect a lot of the things that have been mentioned here will be resounding and reoccurring in the coming weeks and months. So once again, thank you so much and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much.